Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
And it is not a question of a little occultism or a touch of mysticism, Mr. Denton. It is vampirism, and there's a host of damned souls at Pelham House.
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night.
Here, the old gods aren't dead.
And what of the true god?
He's dead. Can't complain.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
You're listening to Paranormal UK Radio.
And good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio, the flagship show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I am not Irene Allen Block, who usually brings us in tonight. Irene is feeling a bit under the weather, so she's going to take the night off. So I am stepping up, and I'm also joined by our other stalwart co-host, Andy Mercer. So, Andy, how are you doing?
Not too bad at all. It's an interesting situation because obviously the last few weeks I've been wearing your shoes. Now I've taken your shoes off and put Irene's shoes on, so they're a bit tight, I have to say.
Yeah, and you know, those heels are a killer too.
Oh, God, I know how she manages it. I really don't. Well, I don't have the bulldog or the tweeting bird with me, so it's a little quieter here. So. No snoring.
We don't have Gertie the paranormal pup snoring in the background or Pickles Pee-wee, you know, having sex with his ball.
Yes, absolutely. It's all quiet here. It's all a bit damp as well. It's a bit dreary and drizzly outside, so I hope everyone's nice and wrapped up warm inside and listening to us on our wonderful radio show.
Oh, yes. It's snowing here in the northeast in the U.S., and bitter cold front hitting most of the northern part of the country. In fact, temperatures, they're saying up in Michigan, I believe, or up around Chicago, they're claiming are even colder than the parts of Antarctica.
Oh, good Lord. It's cold here. We were forecast to get some snow, but at the moment it's just rain, which is quite nice. Don't mind a bit of the rain. Snow is always a pain because my road is a bit on the small side, so it tends to get a bit snowed in if it gets too heavy. But hopefully, touch wood, we're not going to be too bad here. But yeah, it's a damp and dreary sort of end to January, isn't it? So
I just want to ask Al Gore, when were those ice caps supposed to melt again?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. When was that? Was supposed to be like, what, 10 years ago?
Well, that's one of the reasons why it's wetter now, they reckon, because there's more rain, there's more water in the atmosphere, so maybe.
I saw something that Whitley Strieber posted, and I like Whitley. We've had him on the show. I have a lot of respect for him, but he did post today saying that all this Arctic cold weather is actually evidence of global warming. I'm going, okay.
Well, I think they try to call it climate change to cover their backs these days, rather than just say it's going to be warming or cooling, just climate change. But it is one of those big things. I mean, a friend of mine who's really much into geography, his degree was in geography, and he says, we get climatic change. It's normal. It's part of the process of how the world works. It's a breathing, living thing. But there is evidence to say that maybe we have sped it up a little bit. So it's a bit 50-50. It would happen anyway, but we may have made some difference, unfortunately. But you really can't say. The only way you would know is to go back in time and not have the fossil fuels and see what we're like today without fossil fuels. So you can't do it. There's no way of really knowing. And it's like many things. No one's absolutely certain either way. But I don't know. There is some evidence that something may be going on.
Well, I'm not to get into a tangent because we do have our guest waiting in the wings here for the show tonight, but I will say, I mean, nobody could sit there and tell me that, we do not affect the climate. There's too many of us spewing too much stuff into the atmosphere and whatnot. Yes, we're going to affect the climate, but I also agree with you. The Earth is a living, breathing thing. It goes through different climate changes. We just came off of our last ice age 10,000 years ago, and we could be due for another. Who knows?
Well, I mean, technically speaking, some of it's still in evidence. We're still in the very, very tail end of it. So exactly that, come back in a couple of thousand years, we could be burning in the tropics here in sort of the UK, Northern America. It'd be like be like Africa with heat and that kind of thing. But I don't think we'll ever get to see that. I don't think.
A lot of it is what happens with the sun. You know, we don't know the sun does a lot of strange things, and my big fear is if we ever get hit with a CME, then you know that could make life really interesting for us.
Would be a real problem, because that's the funny thing. As I may have mentioned before, I used to be a school teacher and trying to explain to the kids that in the middle of our winter, and yours as well, Northern Hemisphere, we're at the closest to the sun we ever get. And they were like, but sir, it's really cold, it's raining. No, we are closer. That's why the Southern Hemisphere, like Australia at the moment, is absolutely boiling.
Oh, yes.
50 degrees, because obviously they're tilted towards the sun, and we're closer. And trying to explain to the kids the midsummer for us in the Northern Hemisphere is as furthest we get from the sun. And they're like, that doesn't make sense, sir. But that's how the world works. To say it's not straightforward. It does all sorts of strange things and forms movements, patterns of tilts, of angle that makes all the differences.
Yeah, well, we could be like tilted on our side, like was it Neptune? That's like spinning on its side as it goes around.
Absolutely,
that
it's
could
entirely
be
possible. We're going to have the poles will shift north become south as well. That's entirely possible.
Well, they have been tracking the pole. The magnetic pole has been shifting. It's been dragging across the north by many degrees to the point where it's starting to muck up navigation. And you know, there has been a lot of conjecture that we are looking at a major pole shift coming soon. And if that happens, I mean, not just magnetic pole, but you know, the axis. Tilting on our axis and what that will do for our weather. So that we're in for some fun times here, folks.
Yes, although it's a slow process. I hope you won't see too much of it in our lifetimes, but you never know. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that the Earth changes shape as it moves closer to and from the sun because of the pull of the gravity. So even that alters as well. So it's all very confusing.
Yes, very confusing. But you know what? We enough about the weather, because we always bitch about the weather. Let's get on and talk about something more interesting. And with that, we are going to introduce our guest who had appeared on the show a couple of weeks back when we had Mac Maloney and his team from the Military X-Files on the show, but we were also joined by Steve Ward, who is now joining us solo tonight. How are you doing tonight, Steve?
I'm doing great.
Well, thanks for coming on. And you know what? I feel real bad that I missed that show that you were on. It sounded like it was a lot of fun. And but now we got you this time. We got you all to ourselves. So we're going to be talking about a lot of interesting things tonight, especially with cryptids and a lot of strange phenomenon. So let's just go ahead and kick this off. I mean, one of the things that we had talked about that we could go into tonight is a bit about Mothman. And I have to admit, I find Mothman to be one of those really strange types of creatures, phenomena that just seems to defy reality. And yet so many people have seen it. And there's, of course, the famous incident that John Keel chronicled in his book, The Mothman Prophecies, and back in the 60s. And so, I mean, let's chat about that. What are your thoughts on Mothman?
Wow. You know, it brings in... well, just to digress a little bit, I followed John Keel for a long time. I became interested in the UFO phenomena and the paranormal back in March of 1966. In Michigan, we had, Dr. Hynek, Dr. J. Allen Hynek is in the news these days because of the Project Blue Book TV show. I don't know if it's being shown over in England yet, but, all across the U.S. and on cable. And he is famous for that incident in March of 66, where he suggested that some of the sightings in Michigan, by the way, these were happening in my backyard virtually when I was a kid in junior high school. But he suggested that some of the incidents were swamp gas. And of course, that took on a life of its own. But several months later was that first sighting of what they weren't even calling Mothman at the time, this strange winged humanoid creature, which chased two couples down Route 62, just north of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, right along the Ohio River, deep in the Ohio Valley. And John Keel, as you mentioned, he wrote the book he's the most known for, is the Mothman prophecies. But sometime before that, he wrote a book called UFOs Operation Trojan Horse. And that's where he started to link together seemingly different types of paranormal phenomena. And that's kind of where the Mothman comes in. He was there, the main incidents happened over about a 12 to 13 month period leading up to the collapse of the Silver Bridge. This bridge is the one that linked Point Pleasant, West Virginia with Gallipolis, Ohio. Many people think it was connected to the sightings of the Mothman. He spoke to about, a little over 100 witnesses at that time. And they all were reporting generally the same thing. I mean, something was happening. It was a roughly 7 feet tall, kind of grayish black. It had huge wings, sort of bat-like. The wing spread was only about 10, 12 feet or so, while the thing was 7 foot tall. There were a lot of things about this that didn't make sense. I have been able to speak, by the way, to about 6 of the original witnesses. Not everybody saw exactly the same thing, but here's the problem. We want to try and put, we're familiar with Bigfoot reports and the Dog Man and several other types of cryptids. And there's a tendency to want to put these in sort of a flesh and blood context. Some of them you can. Some of them seem to have some paranormal overtones connected with them. But the Mothman is absolutely full of contradictions. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I'm just enraptured listening to what you're saying.
For example, he didn't always flap his wings. Sometimes it was seen to take off straight up like a helicopter. And it would spread its wings and then take off. I mean, just defying the laws of physics. Like I say, a biologist would probably say that the wingspan wasn't big enough to lift a body that size. It had apparently red glowing eyes. And like in many of these cryptid cases, this was not eye shine. This seemed to be generating its own light. But there's some other problems with it. There's, if you really dig into it, John Keel, you can find some of his old lectures that on the internet, and even some of them have even been reprinted now. There are several books out now, by the way, of articles that John Keel wrote over the past several decades, which have been lost in various magazines, and those are really valuable. But he talked to some people that when they were close to this thing, thought they heard kind of a humming or an engine noise. Okay. One of the last people to see the Mothman. Now, the Mothman was the first major sighting was in what they call the TNT area. Now, this is was a munitions area back during World War II, long abandoned, even in the 60s. It is now the McClintock Wildlife Preserve. And they say the original sighting was by the old power plant. And so one of the last sightings in that same area was by a Mrs. Thomas, who also was one of these people that was getting prophetic dreams. That's another thing we can talk about. There was all kinds of strange things going on in this time period. And she said she saw this thing walking through the TNT area, walking very quickly, almost robotic. So, you get these bizarre contradictions. Sometimes it seemed possibly flesh and blood. Other times, more like an apparition that wouldn't have to obey physical laws. Other times, it seemed to be possibly mechanical, and it's very, very hard. I mean, like I say, several people were seeing this thing, experiencing this thing, and saw it up close. Sometimes there was one guy. I'm trying to remember. He was a professional. He's mentioned in the Mothman prophecies, but he wasn't named because of his standing in the community. He saw this thing standing out on his front lawn, and then he lost time for about 15 or 20 minutes, but it was still there. So you had a missing time situation in connection with the Mothman as well. There were a couple times when it was seen in conjunction with a strange light in the sky. I don't know that we have to be careful when we're trying to put these things together, to say that, well, Mothman apparently was an alien or connected to the ET somehow and came out of a UFO. I don't know that we can say that. It's one of these, the thing that's so fascinating, and this is the area that I am most interested in, are the so-called high strangeness areas. People will call them portals, vortexes. John Keel called them window areas, where you get disparate types of paranormal activity all seeming to occur in the same area. And the way that they're linked together is still kind of a mystery.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I am right there with you in terms of, areas of high strangeness utterly fascinate me. It's where I've been putting a lot of focus on the last couple of years. But one thing I wanted to bring up, and Andy, I'd be interested in your take on this too. Because Mothman seems to defy rational explanation in what people are seeing and comparing to how it behaves, I'm wondering if what people are experiencing is a form of screen memory. And Whitley Strieber had mentioned this, and then, what's the gentleman's name? There's an excellent book called Messengers about the owl phenomenon in reference with UFO activity, and owls being used as a screen memory. Somebody will think they've seen an owl when they've actually had an alien contact. And the fact that the Mothman, the way it moves, doesn't seem like a living creature at times. The glowing red eyes, self-generating light, going straight up like a helicopter without flapping its wings. Could it be more of a holographic projection of, or something masking another object?
Oh, yes. I think that that's definitely a possibility. And even when you look at some of the other cryptid sightings, it was what I wanted to mention before I go on. When Keel wrote an earlier book called UFOs Operation Trojan Horse, that's the one where I kind of came kicking and screaming at the time, because I was really happy with, UFOs coming from other planets, and little silver-suited aliens, jumping out and taking soil samples and so forth. And I wasn't comfortable with the idea of all these things somehow being connected. But yes, it does seem like, although there's a paradox, because some of these things, there were actually some footprints found behind the old power plant and in some areas where Mothman was supposed to have been seen. Not absolutely clear that that's what made them. But some of these things do seem to be paraphysical. Stan Gordon, the researcher from Pennsylvania, he and his team examined several reports in southwestern Pennsylvania about 73, 74. They were Bigfoot-like reports. These things had green glowing eyes. They were seen sometimes in conjunction with UFOs or lights or even apparently landed craft on the ground. There was one really bizarre incident where there was this dome-like object on the ground. There were two of these Bigfoots. There were several people there. They took a shot at it. The craft or the image disappeared. The Bigfoots were still there. The guy swore he hit it. They were making a sound like a baby crying. And after this incident, one of the witnesses seemed to be possessed temporarily. He was out in the middle of the field, stomping around, growling. They couldn't figure out what the heck is going on with this guy. Eventually, he came out of his spell or whatever it was. They didn't want to put him under regressive hypnosis because he'd had such a weird reaction. Well, quite some time later, they approached him and said, "Hey, would you mind if we, put you under regressive hypnosis to relive that incident?" And he said, "What do you mean? You came by 2 weeks later." And he said a man apparently from the Air Force and another man dressed in plain clothes put him under hypnosis, said that they would get back to him. And of course, they never did. So, and then there was another incident at the same time where a woman, not familiar with this stuff at all, not familiar with Bigfoot or whatever, she hears some noise on her porch. She thinks some dogs are getting in her trash. She opens the door, and right there on her porch or near her porch is what she described as a gorilla. It raises its arms up. She hits it point blank with a shotgun, and it disappears in a hail of sparks. So, there are all kinds of bizarre incidents. And, the more you get into some of these things, it's so hard to put them in a category. And so with the Mothman, it's the same thing. There's just so many we just have this incredible paradox. On the other hand, there are Bigfoot reports, for example, in Ohio and the Northwest, where they seem very much flesh and blood, leaving footprints, even hair samples and so forth. So you get a real major paradox in when we try to figure these things out. And, every time we think we've got something, it slips through our fingers.
Again, that's the whole nature of it and how strange this phenomenon seems to be. It doesn't seem to obey our laws of physics or normality. And it's one of the things that makes me feel, and Andy, like your thoughts on this, makes me feel that our perception of reality is incomplete or just flat out wrong. And what's really reality around us is far stranger than we can ever imagine.
I would very much agree with everything that Steve and you are saying there. I'm too of the same opinion that these things are not simply nuts and bolts spaceships for little alien planets, little green men in them. There is more definitely going on. And I think you're absolutely right as well about the whole idea of perception, that what we might think we're actually seeing is not necessarily what's actually in front of us. That for these sorts of things, often because the phenomena themselves are so strange, our brains are trying to understand what on earth it is we're looking at. And as you guys know, I'm involved in psychotherapy as my profession, so I know very much about perception and how perception can be fooled, and you think you're seeing one thing when you're seeing something else. It's very much based on your own ideas, understandings and expectations. One of the phenomena that I've noticed investigating unusual events is very much that the mindset of the person who witnesses these things can determine what they believe they're seeing. The most common one, which I know I've mentioned before, but it fits in what we're talking about here, is people who have things like what they call the old hag experience, or night terrors, or sleep paralysis, hypnagogic dreaming, and where you start to believe you're seeing something in the room with you, like an alien or a witch or a monster. I often found, talking to people who had those kinds of experiences, depending on whether they were into sci-fi and aliens, etc., they would see aliens. If they were more into the supernatural, ghosts or horror films even, they'd see something monstrous or like a witch. So what they might be seeing actually in the room is open to debate, but what they perceived was based more on their own belief systems, their understanding. And it's interesting, Steve, you're saying about the woman who had no knowledge of all this sort of stuff, looked out and saw a gorilla. Now, that doesn't really fit in with a description of Mothman or really a Yeti or a Bigfoot, although you can say there's some similarities to a Bigfoot. But because her understanding didn't go into that rather strange realm, she was only aware of more conventional creatures. She saw a conventional creature, which then behaved very, very strangely, of course, from what you're saying there with the sparks and everything. But yeah, I mean, I often think these things are almost amorphous. They don't have a particular form in themselves. It's what your expectation of them is, that's what you're going to see. And again, it kind of fits you saying with the owl phenomena thing as well, because it's something that you can relate to. You can understand that in the average Joe public can make sense of an owl, but then if it's not actually an owl, but that's how their mind's perceiving it, it kind of makes sense because it fits in with what they understand, what they believe they're witnessing. So, yeah, I think we can say that these things are more amorphous and don't have an identity other than those which we kind of project onto them. So it is a kind of a screen effect that's going on, definitely.
Well, my question would be, is it ourselves projecting onto it, or, as I suspect, in a lot of cases, especially in people who deal with UFOs and abduction phenomenon, that they're having screen memories or implanted, or these things are able to take the shape based on what they can kind of reading that person's mind and taking on a shape that they could somewhat understand, because otherwise maybe their true form or identity is beyond our comprehension. Because I really feel we deal with as physical human beings. We walk around in these meat suits, okay? So we have our eyes are able to see, our ears are able to hear, we can touch, we can taste, and we can perceive to a point with our minds, but our minds are only so developed. Doesn't mean that we are actually able to process other forms of reality that maybe go beyond our senses.
Yeah, very much. That really is what we're saying, that it is within what you can perceive as individual. Now, you can also argue that maybe it's more of a collective thing, that it's something that we can collectively perceive that you're witnessing, rather than, as I say, the form itself, that it may be just something we can't really grasp because it is so strange. I mean, there's a classic story that I think I've mentioned before that's really interesting. When the Columbus and co. travelled across the ocean to come to the New World, some of the places they landed, the descriptions of the natives who were living there at the time were as if the men appeared from nowhere. Now, of course, we know they sailed in ships, but because the natives had no conception of vessels like that, no idea about ships, they had some vague sense of something on the horizon, and then these men seemed to appear from nowhere because they had nothing in their minds that they could relate that strange object, which we would recognise as a sailing ship. But to them, it didn't comprehend. It had no meaning to them, so therefore they literally couldn't see it. I mean, there are other examples in history where that kind of phenomenon occurs, where it's a culture encounters something that has no idea about at all, and it can't relate to it. So it almost doesn't see it. Because the way our minds work is whenever you see anything, your brain automatically compares it to everything else you've ever seen to give you a sense of what the hell you're looking at. That's why you know, well, a fork is a fork and not a knife or a giraffe, because it's comparing what it already knows. But if your mind can encounter something visually that there's no reference to, no frame of reference whatsoever, then it can even be edited out, or, as these guys are experiencing, the same in the New World, or it takes on a different form that relates to what you kind of understand, that you kind of can make sense of, like I say, the one with the gorilla. So that very much agree that we can't say for definite how the mechanisms of the mind is working with these sort of phenomena, but certainly that idea that it's something that's not quite what it appears to be, absolutely.
I think there's probably more than one answer as well. For a while, I did full swing and I rejected the idea of ET. But now I think that there probably is, along with this mechanism in human consciousness or whatever it is, that there are probably others among us, as Albert Rosales would call them. But it's interesting because Keel was on this early, and he used the term ultra-terrestrial to differentiate from extraterrestrial. And it wasn't an original term with him. He borrowed it from Ivan Sanderson, the great British naturalist who was living in New Jersey and was a colleague of John Keel. Sanderson was probably most well known for the book Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. And he also wrote some great books on UFOs. But Keel said he used the term ultra-terrestrial as kind of a literary device because he wasn't sure what the intelligence or energy was behind it. But he believed that it would, and I love this word, would transmogrify into something that was temporarily physical. It wasn't merely an illusion, but it could leave footprints, it could interact physically with the surroundings. And he looked at, he thought the only, perhaps the only, and he wasn't static in his thinking, by the way, he entertained other ideas, but he thought perhaps the only reality of some of these things were the strange meandering lights. He thought maybe they were objectively real, but somebody would see one of these things. They would be programmed, and similar to some of the ways you guys are just talking about. One would see a hairy, shambling biped. Another one would see a giant, mile-long craft in the sky. But they weren't merely illusions or hallucinations. Something was really happening. And he pointed out that, if you go way back in history, those strange lights were called by the Chinese dragon tracks. In another era, when they believed in witches flying on brooms, of course, if you saw a light moving through the sky, that was a witch carrying a lantern on the broom. In later years, we had the Foo Fighters. We have and orbs and the fairy lights and so forth. And also he thought that the manifestations of the UFO phenomena, if you go back throughout history, you remember the reports around 1897 of the massive dirigible-like airships all over the U.S. and other parts of the world. Yes. This is before, Zeppelins were really of any use. And then you had, like I mentioned before, you had the ghost planes and so forth from Sweden way up north. And then you had the Foo Fighters. And then you had the more acceptable bug-eyed monster type landings and sightings of UFOs in the 40s, 50s, 60s and on up. So he believed that the the appearance, the manifestation of these things were kind of changing with us and reflecting our attitudes.
That would make absolute sense to me entirely. I mean, that's one of the things that's often struck me is how many different kinds of creatures people see around the world. And very rarely do you get the same creature being seen in different parts of the world. I mean, the phenomena, the Bigfoot phenomena, it seems to be predominantly located in North America. I mean, obviously there are claims in Europe, etc., but it's far, far rarer in Europe. Now, there are remote parts of Europe, like obviously Scandinavia is a good example. You don't tend to get reports of Bigfoot, but you get reports of other creatures. Trolls is another one that you tend to get throughout history, as I say, in Scandinavian regions. So you've got creatures that are definitely not normal, shall we say, excuse me, that are crypto, shall we say, but they appear different to different cultures, suggesting again there's not one particular form, that they take different forms depending on who's looking at them. And some research I did for a book I wrote last year, a couple of years ago now, that was to do with look at a lot of folklore stories in the UK particularly, and there are reports of strange creatures, but they are often the kind of thing you see almost in fairy stories now, fairies literally, sort of elves and then smaller creatures, those kind of creatures that you see, as I say, in Grimm's fairy tales. But of course Grimm's fairy tales are all based on mythology as well, so they're not made up out of the blue, they've come from myths and legends. So you see those strange odd creature phenomena occurring throughout history, but they do tend to vary in their appearance and description of them depending on what time frame or what people you're talking to, or what point in history. Definitely.
Yes, and there's a let me I want to give you one case here. The famous case of Joe Symington and the cosmic pancakes from outer space. You maybe
rings
don't
a bell.
Yes. Okay. Eagle River, Wisconsin, 1961. Joe Symington, he's a plumber and a chicken farmer by day. He's on his farm. He hears this awful noise. He looks out and he sees your classic UFO. It's like two plates stuck together. And there's a hatch there open. It's kind of hovering off the ground. And he approaches it, looks inside. There's 3 men inside. And they don't seem to be threatening. It's a pretty strange situation, but he doesn't feel like he's in any kind of danger. And they hand him a big silver chalice, and they kind of indicate that they want water through sign language. There's no telepathy, there's no speech. So this is like the food from fairyland kind of thing, exchanging if you go back into folklore. So Joe goes to his pump, fills it up with water, gives it to this guy, and he notices behind him, this is a small, cramped craft. One guy's working on a control panel. The other guy is looks like he's cooking pancakes on an open, flameless grill. All right. Yes, very nice. And so he gives him a few of these pancakes, apparently in exchange for them giving water. Now you can wonder why ETs would need an external water source. I hate to think what the plumbing situation is on there. And it would think that they would have maybe some Tang and some freeze-dried food.
Maybe they needed it because the loo was backed up.
Yeah, that would be maybe. Yes, at least I didn't ask Joe to vacate their commode. But anyway, so he has it. It doesn't last very long. He tells this local judge that he knows. Project Blue Book gets involved. Dr. J. Allen Hynek gets involved. Everybody thinks that this guy he's a solid guy. He doesn't make up stories. And why they don't believe it, they believe that he does. Okay. The Air Force, by the way, before I'd say the Air Force actually spent taxpayers' money to examine the ingredients of these cosmic pancakes, right? Yes. But in the meantime, the judge who tend to believe Joe had a real experience, he still was a bit tongue in cheek. And he said, well, Joe, what do these guys look like? Little green men? And Joe says, well, no, they were kind of swarthy like Italians. They're about 5 feet tall. They're in coveralls. Now, a little segue. John Keel, in one of his articles, talks about how he discovered an old press conference with General Spaatz, big general out of World War II, 1948. He actually says in part of this news conference, there is no truth to the rumor that Spaniards are driving flying saucers or that flying saucers come from Spain. So John Keel checks around for any other kind of news source clippings or whatever to see if people were reporting that at that time, and he couldn't find anything. He had to assume that they were actually getting reports from people that were seeing this kind of an occupant sometimes in one of these craft. And sure enough, Keel eventually would get these kind of stories where people would report, in quotes, dark Mediterranean types, or in quotes, foreigners, right? Of course, you can be a foreigner depending on where you're living. But anyway, so, and even some of the, if you get into some of the Men in Black lore, you get the same kind of description sometimes. So, that's really interesting there. But then, now another segue. Andy and I talked a little bit about the folklore connection and modern day UFO experiences the last time we talked. Well, there was a man named Evans Wentz who around 1910, he was an anthropologist, I believe, and he went around collecting stories of the little people, and not just tales handed down from generation to generation, but firsthand accounts in the same way we go around talking to people about their cryptid or UFO experience. And he was told that the fairies drink fresh water, eat fresh meat, but never take salt. Guess what was the one ingredient that was not found in those pancakes, those otherwise normal pancakes, was sodium. Yeah. So again, now back to what you were talking about before, depending on when this event occurred, if it was a real event, you're going to interpret it in a certain way. If it happened 100 or 200 years ago, people are going to interpret it as the fairies, in spite of these strange craft they rode in. In modern day, well, of course, they're aliens coming down to take a sample of our water or do whatever. So that's, when you get, again, we don't know how physically real it was, although, allegedly Joe got some real pancakes, even though he said they tasted horrible and he would never take a ride with them because their food was so bad. But anyway, that's always been a fascinating case for me, because it's one of those, where do we put it? Where does it belong?
It's fascinating. You have those little underlying connections that almost you can draw a line between different phenomena and events that you'd think have no connection at all. Little elements start to emerge. That idea of the small, we'll use the word foreigner, the sort of Mediterranean look, Spanish, Italian, probably Greek as well, that kind of theme running through. And then the idea of the no sodium, no salt. It's interesting, isn't it? There's little bits and pieces that, if you were faking the stories, you'd have to dig deep to find these little connections to sort of throw them in there, suggesting that whatever's real, they're experiencing certainly something, definitely.
Yeah, that's the thing, when you look at some of these experiences that people report, if you're going to spin a tale, there's certain things you don't do, there's certain things you don't say. And, you're going to try and make it as believable as possible. And, these, when you add up all these elements together, they don't make any sense. But it's interesting once, again, this is, as I do my upcoming show, I'm going to be mentioning John Keel a lot, because people will obviously see that he's influenced me a great deal. He had developed kind of a catchphrase. And the catchphrase was, ask the contactee, the abductee, the experiencer, what he or she had for breakfast. And what he meant was, find out about the individual. Don't just take the report at face value. Find out everything else about them. And he would find that people that would have, say, a close encounter with what was apparently some kind of a humanoid or alien had all kinds of other things going on around them. They would have electrical interference in their house. Yes. Sometimes a poltergeist would break out after. There was a Reverend Apollo in 1968 in Youngstown, Ohio. He had sort of a, well, for lack of a better word, mundane encounter with some kind of a entity. Then later on, this crazy poltergeist phenomena breaks out, including the sound of a baby crying. That's one I wasn't aware of, that the people that are ghost hunters and so forth have talked about how that's one of the things that they encounter, are the sound of a baby crying in the middle of nowhere.
You've shown that, yeah. It's one of those things that has sort of peaks before that. I've done a lot of paranormal investigating of sort of ghost and haunted locations, and there's some of those certain phenomena that you do kind of encounter more often than others, if you like, and that is one of the idea of sort of crying, and that particular child's voice crying out, definitely.
And you wonder, what the heck does that have to do with a a extraterrestrial spacecraft if that's what it was? What did it trigger? Or, is it all part of this, I don't know, this super spectrum that Keel talks about? So it's very, very mystifying. This is my passion, though. When I gave you these examples of some of the way these things connect, there's a lot of other things. There's crop circles connect with saucer nests, with fairy rings, and so forth. We can go into that if you want. There are. Okay, let's talk about that a little bit, because these are so fascinating. There is nowadays, or in recent history, we have had the phenomena of crop circles, and we know for a fact that sometimes they're man-made, and even the very complex ones. I know somebody that went to England some years ago and was part of a group of people that made them. On the other hand,
the naughty man.
Yes. Well, they may have had permission. Sometimes they get permission from the farmer, and sometimes they go under cover of darkness. So I didn't ask if it was sneaky or not. Yeah, no fun to know. Now, other people, I've heard them. I've never talked to one person one-on-one, but some people say that they were out there and they actually saw one form in a matter of moments. And some people will say, well, it's ET, or it's some kind of satellite radar from the military or something. I heard a report, Linda Moulton Howe, some time ago. She interviewed some people that were out at night forming these crop circles. And have you seen these like YouTube videos or whatever, where these little balls of light supposedly show up around the crop circle?
Yeah, I've seen those.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, well, supposedly they were out there and they were doing this, and all of a sudden this light phenomena shows up, as if to say, either, hey, this is our job, or some people say the simple act of doing this meditation and this connection with Mother Earth has created the phenomena. So, I tell people that's too complicated for me. I'm a pensioner, so I like to harken back to a simpler time. So if we go back to the 1960s, we had something we called saucer nests. And there was a famous one in Queensland, Australia.
Oh, yes.
Remember that? Delroy, Ohio was covered in Fate magazine years ago. And there were times when people saw a craft or a strange light in the distance come down to the field. They go there the next day and they see this depressed area. Okay, you can wrap your head around that. Problem is, these things have been around long before Kenneth Arnold had his sighting in 1947. And of course, they tried to explain these things as, all kinds of strange atmospheric phenomena and whirlwinds and so forth. But in the olden days, they would have called them fairy rings, because they saw the little people sometimes dancing around these fairy rings. And not only that, you could see the orbs or the fairy lights or UFOs, whatever you want to call them, moving around these things. And again, you had, Evans Wentz, and even, I guess, Sir Walter Scott went around talking to people about their experiences with these elementals. And sometimes they would tell them about how mushrooms would grow around the outer parameter of these. Well, there's actually a couple in a MUFON journal in the mid-70s. There's there were a couple reports in Argentina where there was one where the civilian pilot was flying over an area. He saw kind of a strange formation or circle or something on the ground. The military was alerted. They come down there, and it is kind of a circular saucer nest kind of a thing. And strange lights had been seen in that area. And there were about 6 or 7 rather sizable mushrooms growing around the outer parameter of this. Now, there's no way to verify this. There was another one a few years earlier, I think, not too far from a school. The other one was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. So, if there's any truth at all to that, isn't that bizarre? That brings the circle completely around. Crop circles, saucer nests, fairy rings, mushrooms, past and present. What the hell is going on?
We used to have one in the school grounds of my old secondary school that was basically mushrooms would grow in this very dark circle of this ring that was actually in the middle of the field, and people used to tell stories about it being alien spaceships landing, especially the first years of school.
Oh, that's
used
cool.
to tell them that's what that was, but it was genuinely, it was actual mushrooms growing. But yeah,
right.
I mean, that's one of the things. Crop circles are fascinating themselves. The vast majority of them I'm absolutely convinced are man-made, but there are historic reports that go back far further. There's the mowing devil, I think it was called. There's an article. It's in the 1600s that has like a what you call it, the wood carving kind of where they used to make drawings of things. It's like a block print of what looks like the devil mowing the grass. It's drawing a big circle on the ground. So clearly they do go back much further. But yeah, I mean, the vast majority are definitely man-made for sure. But yeah, those connections, isn't it? That's the fascinating thing, that you find these things that underlying, there are strange links that you wouldn't imagine you'd find with the different phenomena and experiences that do seem to draw them in together.
Oh, by the way, I wanted to, when we were talking about these things sort of taking on the shape or, the expectations of the viewer. Yeah. If we go back to one of the earliest paranormal investigators, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, of course, is world famous, throughout the cosmos famous for Sherlock Holmes.
Absolutely.
Everybody knows that. But he was basically a paranormal investigator. He firmly, of course, believed in the fairies and that people were really having these experiences. But he said that the appearance of the fairies was largely dependent on the individual viewing them. Isn't that interesting? He sounds like he and John Keel would have had a lot to talk about.
Yeah. As I say, that's one of the things you don't know, Steve, I've talked about already, is that we're both of that mindset that these things are like a third place phenomenon, as I like to refer to them. They're not aliens, they're not ghosts, they don't fit the category. That fundamentally these things have been categorized by us, because that's how our minds work. We work with ideas of pigeonholing things, of determined forms and shapes that we can comprehend. But these things are somewhere beyond that. And I've said the same kind of things you're saying there. They're not just in your head, and they're not just out there in front of you. They're somewhere in that third place where they are kind of in the middle between the subject-object relation, which is how we perceive the world. Don't go down that path. It gets a bit boggy. But that idea that they're not just the thing you're seeing, and they're not just in your head. They're in that third space. Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Well, you've talked an awful lot about the stuff that you're interested in, but I want to hear a bit more about you. How you got interested in this whole sort of thing in the first place? How did you become fascinated by this strange world we're living in?
Well, I mentioned it very briefly, but of course, I've always been interested in science fiction and that kind of thing. But when like I say, March of 1966, we had very credible sightings of a major UFO flap in Michigan, south central Michigan, Ann Arbor, Dexter, Hillsdale. And again, I was in junior high, so I didn't have any wheels to go play a UFO investigator. But it was fascinating to see this unfold on TV. And there were very credible sightings by police officers and so forth. And, the mainstream media was covering it, and a little tongue-in-cheek, of course. But that was March. But it was that following November when that first report came over, that report where the Scarberries and the Mallets were chased by this winged humanoid down Route 62, let's say November 15th, 1966. That was pretty amazing. And little did I know I would be following the Mothman for the rest of my life. I'm very involved in the Great Mothman Festival they do every third week of September. Yes. I started out as somebody that just attended and had a great time. And now I help behind the scenes. I have spoken there the last couple years and will probably speak there again this year. I also do something that's really a lot of fun. I mentioned the TNT area. And what they do is they have what they call it's kind of like a Halloween hayride a little bit. There's three of us and we're pulled by a tractor. And so we take people in big groups through the dreaded TNT area in the dead of night. And let me tell you, gentlemen, that place is creepy in the daytime, and at night it's really something. Without the Mothman, it's creepy. And first, the men in black would be there to try and stop you from going in. They've got their little megaphone, and sometimes they'll chase you in a golf cart. I guess the black Cadillac was in the repair. And they do a great job. And
did
then,
it have the nice
they have a little bit of,
1950s, wings on the back?
Well, a little bit later on, two of my friends, you'll have a guaranteed flyover of the Mothman, and which is they have this ingenious low-tech setup where when the tram comes through at a certain point, the Mothman will come across on some wires with red glowing eyes and a great sound effect, which was actually much better. The actual Mothman, people said it sounded like a squeaky fan belt or something like that. But so you can't have a squeaky fan belt noise to try and scare the people. So we have a really, really cool sound effect. But it is it's a really good. It has everything. It has the history, the geography. You have a whole series for 2 days. You've got speakers on different aspects of the paranormal. Ghost hunters, people that are involved in UFOs, cryptid people. So it really is a good event.
I've attended quite a few events in my time. I love them. It's a great atmosphere. It's a great way to meet people, discuss, share ideas. And getting back with the Mothman phenomenon, John Keel, because I'll admit I have not had a chance to read a lot of John Keel's other works, but I did read the Mothman prophecies. And what's ironic to me is everybody focuses on Mothman, but that was actually a small part of what was an extraordinary phenomenon dealing with high strangeness, UFOs, incredible Men in Black encounters. And yes. And one of the more interesting ones that aspects of that case was Indrid Cold.
Oh, yes.
And now there was the movie that came out about 10 years ago or so with Richard Gere based on the book. And you know what? I love that movie. Now, again, it wasn't a literal retelling. It was dramatized. They changed a lot of things, but it got the spirit of what the phenomenon was like. I thought it nailed the spirit of the phenomenon and what people dealt with. They took a few incidents from the book, including the bridge as the climax, but the whole Indrid Cold thing of who this person supposedly was, if it was a person. What are your thoughts on that phenomenon?
Right, and by the way, John Keel agrees with you about the film. He, in fact, I forget who it was he told, but when he'd held off for years to get a decent script for his book, rather than just make a fast buck. And he was actually giddy, I guess, when he got this particular script. I think Mark Pellington was the director, and he said, they've updated it and they've got me married and so forth. He said, but they have captured the essence of the book. And when he was interviewed by Art Bell on Coast to Coast AM back in 2003, he told Art, he said, the one thing that this really got was the feeling of paranoia that I felt and the atmosphere that happened at the time. So the one thing I did regret in the movie, and I know why they didn't do it, they didn't pursue the Men in Black thing too much, although they kind of put that in with the Indrid Cold stuff. But just a few years before, they'd had the silly Men in Black movies, which was based on a graphic novel, which was based on the actual folklore, if you will. So it was too bad that they didn't have that, a little more of that. But the Indrid Cold thing is really bizarre. Again, you're going to get this paradox where some aspects seem to be real and others don't. What had happened was, John Keel teamed up with Mary Hyre. Mary Hyre was a local reporter in the area, and she was well-liked, and she was a great journalist. She wrote a column, Where the Waters Mingle, referring to the Ohio River and the Kanawha River, right there where Point Pleasant is. And she got a report. There was a guy that came forward and said, I just got to tell somebody. And he was driving down this Route 77, he and another man, and they had this elongated craft, pursued them, landed, and then forced their car to stop off the side of the road. And this man gets out, with kind of dark features and so forth, with his arms crossed, and he talks to the men, and he has this really mundane conversation for somebody flying around in a craft, like, who are you? Where are you going? What do you do? And then he leaves. So this guy isn't going to tell anybody. He starts drinking and starts having his bad dreams very quickly. And this is early November, by the way, before the Mothman stuff erupted. And so Mary Hyre got a hold of John Keel. He told him the story. And so finally this guy says, you know what? I've decided not to go forward with this even as a blind item. I don't want anybody to know. And he said, that scientist fella said that we should forget all about it. And John Keel said, what scientist fella? And he told him, some guy from some university, I don't remember his name, said he knew all about it and you should just not worry about it. And Keel said, well, how did he find out? Did you tell anybody else besides me or Mary Hyre? And he said, no, damned if I know. So Keel filed it away and thought, well, there's nothing he can do with this, not even as a blind item. A day or two later is when the Indrid Cold thing broke in the news. That was Woodrow Derenberger following the same route, same kind of experience. This craft lands, the man gets out, he's got his arms crossed, dark features, and he asks him a series of mundane questions. But he also tells him he's from the galaxy of Ganymede. Now, of course, Ganymede is a moon of Jupiter. They have a brief conversation. He says he will see him again, and he gives him his name, Indrid Cold. So there's a little more to this experience than the other one. Now, and then there was a little bit later, John Keel finds a woman that lives across the river in Gallipolis. And she contacted him. She'd been having all kinds of strange things going on her property. There was a farm, and she was having animal mutilations. She had apparitions in her house. Her son was seeing these large, sort of almost boxcar-like silent craft coming over their land. She would go to the police, and they would just laugh her off. She told John Keel, and she's very nervous, by the way. She keeps looking at him like, is he going to believe me? Is he going to think I'm crazy? And she had an experience with an Indrid Cold type character as well. I think she worked in the hospital. She was leaving late one night, and in the parking lot, this craft descends very quietly, and two men get out. And they're sort of Indrid Cold types. I mean, they were wearing coveralls, I think. She thought they looked like foreigners. And again, she was paralyzed. She couldn't move. The same kind of mundane, nonsensical conversation. And then they left. And then she asked John Keel, she said, because by this time, Woodrow Derenberger had been in the newspaper with his because he went to the police and it was covered on the local news. And she asked Keel, she said, did that man ever see that guy again, see Indrid Cold again? And John Keel said, well, he says he did. And she looked relieved because she said a day or two later, right in downtown Gallipolis, Ohio, she saw the same two men dressed in normal clothes, and they kind of nodded at her like she would know them. And she was freaking out. She didn't know what to make of any of this. Now, on the other hand, even Woodrow Derenberger's, I think, stepdaughter said that after a while, he started to embellish some of his experiences. He said that Indrid Cold took him to Lanalos, which was the planet he was supposed to have come from. So it's one of these things that I think though that Woodrow Derenberger was actually able. He would tell his family when they went out and about, you're going to see a UFO when you're out, and sure enough, they would see a strange light up in the sky when they went out there. So you had some elements that seem to be real experiences corroborated by other people. You have part of it that seems to be a hoax, and then you have other parts that seem to have some kind of paranormal overtones. So again, you try to make sense of this stuff, and it just slips through your fingers.
It's so weird, and again, when you're dealing with the Men in Black phenomenon, I remember one time John Keel had mentioned having was it him or himself or somebody else he was retelling a story, having a sit-down conversation with this man in black. And this guy was being very pleasant, but he was obviously wearing makeup. And do you know the story I'm talking about?
I think you're talking about Dr. Hopkins in Maine.
Okay, that might have been it then. Gentleman wearing a hat, was obviously wearing makeup, and he kept, picking things up and looking at them like he'd never seen them before during this conversation. It makes you wonder, what's going on with all the theatrics. I mean, they're trying to blend in.
Right, but what are they? I think that also there might be a couple stories in there. Mary Heyer had some strange men come into her office right in downtown Point Pleasant, and there was one one short guy who had kind of odd-looking eyes and everything was trying to. He was disparaging John Keel, I think, and he sees a ballpoint pen on the counter, and he's fascinated by it. And so she lets him take it. It's like he'd never seen a ballpoint pen before. But there's been a lot of really strange encounters. By the way, John Keel, when he used the term, he said men in black. It was kind of a generic term because, sometimes they did seem to represent men in dark clothes with fedoras or whatever. Other times they kind of referred to Air Force officers that may have shown up, but not Air Force officers, as it turned out later. So there's that sort of a blanket term that covers all kinds of strange people that either try to find out about your UFO experience or suggest that you don't talk about it. There's some, the one I mentioned briefly, the Dr. Hopkins one was, that's the one where he thought he seemed to be wearing makeup. That has been called into some question, and it may a nephew of his came forward a few years later and thought that he made it up. And there's a more recent book that took some issue with it. But I went back to the source, which was Dr. Berthold Schwartz in UFO Dynamics. They were colleagues he was a colleague of Dr. Hopkins, and Hopkins had done a regressive hypnosis for their UFO organization for the Stevens case. It was some kind of a missing time thing back then. And later on, he gets this call where this gentleman wants to come over and talk about the files. And it's this really weird guy. He said, told him that you told him what kind of coins he had in his pocket. And he made the coins disappear. And he said, do you know what happened to Barney Hill? Of course, Betty and Barney Hill, the famous abduction. And Hopkins said, well, I think Barney Hill died of a heart attack. Actually, it was a cerebral hemorrhage. And the man said, no, he died because he had no heart, just because how you no longer have a coin in your hand anymore, because the coin disappeared. It's a really creepy story with a lot more detail. I don't know why Hopkins would make it up, and Dr. Berthold Schwartz thought he didn't. But let me give you another example of a Man in Black story.
Okay.
That was investigated by Jenny Randalls. And Jenny Randall's a great British researcher. There was a lady that's witnessed I can't remember where, but she witnessed a UFO. And a couple of men showed up, supposedly from the government. Now, some of the men in black look very strange. They have a very weird countenance. Well, these guys look pretty normal. But they started, now her parents let them in without any question, and they couldn't understand why. It's almost like, the vampire motif, where if you invite them in, they're in, and there's no way to get rid of them. So they start asking, one of them starts asking this young lady questions, and she's very disturbed by it. And they're firing one after another, and they're not particularly, they're not questions that are going to really illuminate very much. So Jenny Randalls and her team got the idea of, why don't we, put this young lady under regressive hypnosis to see what she was really feeling about all this. So they did that, and they found out, at least in this woman's, from her perspective, while the one man was asking a verbal question to her, the other man was firing a telepathic question to her alternately. Neither series of questions meant very much, but she was very disturbed by it. She couldn't understand what was going on, where she was getting a verbal question and a telepathic question. Now, this was investigated by some very credible people, and I don't know what to make of that either. But if you go back, it's almost, some people call the Men in Black phenomena as sort of a modern day manifestation of the devil, or a sort of a modern day devil theory. And there does seem to be some similarities to that folklore and modern day folklore of the Men in Black.
There also, I believe that there is some connection to possible even fairy lore with Men in Black type of high strangeness and phenomenon that's very similar to some reports over the years of dealing with either the fairies in the UK or Andy, do you have does that ring a bell to you?
Very much so. The imagery we have modern times of fairies, like the sort of thing you see from Disney, etc., is very, very far away from those kind of creatures. Yeah, the idea of them visiting and questioning people in their homes, it's not that far removed from the kind of stories you do see and do read, particularly of sort of 1800s, of these like myths and stories about the fairy folk who visit and take babies away, and they talk to the people in the house and disappear underground. So yeah, there's definitely are parallels there. Steve, where do you think they come from? I know it's a bit of a broad question, but what is your take on what you've read about and you've discovered about them?
Nick Redfern has done a great job, and he's written about 4 books covering the Men in Black phenomena, and from all aspects, and covered it in other books as well. Some of them, again, under this umbrella, this generic term, are simply real flesh and blood people from the government messing around, maybe actually trying to get people to be quiet about their UFO experience. I also wonder if in some cases of course they're familiar with the literature. I wonder if they did some some kind of a program where they sort of took on the persona of the Men in Black and messed with witnesses to kind of test the reaction. I think the government oftentimes is up to all kinds of mischief, but the ones that are, for lack of a better word, paranormal, the ones that are so odd, where they have a certain appearance, the pointed features, the long tapering fingers, I don't know. It's almost like they're part of that phantom menagerie along with everything else. I mean, they may come from the same place as the paranormal Bigfoot or the Mothman or some of these other things, and then just kind of fade back into wherever it is they come from. It's very, unfortunately, I'm not a guy with a lot of answers, but I like you, I see those strange connections. Even the sulfurous smell comes up with Bigfoot, with demons, with Men in Black. Absolutely. With UFO pilots sometimes. Not always, but there's it's just very interesting. I wanted to go mention some other weird connections, because this can be a very physical phenomena. We have hundreds of cases where the close proximity of a UFO and a vehicle, the vehicle stalls, and we assume, okay, it's some kind of a electromagnetic effect, it's interfacing with the engine somehow and causing it to cut out. But then you look at there's other things that stop vehicles. 1960, I believe, North Cumberland, England. I might have that wrong, but there's a lady named Dorothy Strong. She's being driven in a taxi cab, and all of a sudden, a phantom army starts to manifest. Now, it's not terribly unusual for a phantom army to manifest in parts of England. It's happened, and also Gettysburg and so forth. But what happened was that they see this army, and it looks like it's marching toward them, and as it gets close, it fades out. All of a sudden, the taxi cab stalls. The fare meter goes crazy, and they feel like they're being hit by a invisible wall. The Phantom Army, and by the way, it was the Battle of Otterburn from 1388. And the reason they know that is because it isn't the first time this thing is manifested. And apparently some history buff has seen the uniforms and could identify what it was. But anyway, it dissipates. Everything goes back to normal. The fare meter settles out, and the engine starts again. And now let's get back into cryptids. All right, about 1960, near Marlington, West Virginia. It's a 2-lane. W.C. Doc Priestley. He's cruising along in his car. Hasn't had any trouble with his car. And he's following a bus. They're kind of going caravan style. He and some of his friends are headed somewhere. All of a sudden, the car stalls and coasts to a stop. He looks up and he sees what looks like a classic Bigfoot staring at him. The Bigfoot, now then his friends eventually see that he's not behind him anymore. The bus stops, turns around, and is starting to come back. The Bigfoot decides to recede into the woods. Priestley can start his car again. So they take off. He gets a very short distance down the road. All of a sudden, it starts to sputter and stop, and sparks start flying out from the engine. And sure enough, Mr. Bigfoot, either the same Bigfoot or his kissing cousin, is standing right there by the side of the road, and it has affected his car. There's a few cases on record like that where a cryptid seems to interface with the vehicle. Now, how do we explain that? Is that some people say Bigfoot's interdimensional. So was he going through the process of manifestation somehow in the same way that the Phantom Army was, that caused some effect on the car? How do we process that?
That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The idea that the EM field around you is affected, which is often the phenomenon we do with ghost investigations. You get that kind of EMF readings going a bit strange, and they're often the reports of power failing in equipment like chemicals, etc., suddenly draining of all energy, even though they're like brand new or recently recharged, and then phenomena starts to occur. So it seems to be that it's almost like, one way you see it is kind of shifting dimensions. It takes a lot of power and causes sort of electrical discharge and causes electrical effect before these things actually properly manifest. So yeah.
But it's crazy. I mean, if I had that happen to me, I don't think I'd tell a bloody soul. Yeah, I got car trouble, and it's because this Bigfoot was hanging out nearby. But here, let me tell you my favorite vehicle stoppage of all time, and it has nothing to do with a combustion engine. All right, Elliot O'Donnell is another one of these early paranormal investigators, for lack of a better term. Late 1800s, early 1900s, he wrote a series of books, and in Ghostland, he talks about a relative of his in Limerick, Ireland, and he and his servant named Dunkley. Now, this has got to be a true story if you've got a servant named Dunkley, right? So the owner, this relative, he's actually a uncle by marriage, is being driven by his servant in their buggy and single horse. All of a sudden, the horse comes to a dead stop. So he turns around to look. He's had his back to his driver. He turns around and looks and sees the horse is stopped dead. The horse is shivering. His servant has a look of absolute terror on his face and seems to be in kind of a stupor. And also, he looks down and he sees these little shadowy forms that are swarming around the wagon and kind of ascending up on the wagon. So he grabs the reins and breaks the spell and takes off. So they get a mile or two away, and his servant comes out of it, and he asks him, what happened? What did you see? Now, from his mind's eye, he saw a troop of dancing fairies making merry. And I guess it's bad news when you come upon the fairies and they're having a good time. They don't like it. So in his mind, they looked angry. They were starting to climb on the wagon and trying to pull him off. So he was terrified. So interesting that, again, if you're going to spin a tale, why would you say that each man experienced something different? But not only that, think about some of the classic UFO abductions. Betty and Barney Hill, the early 1960s, one of the most famous UFO abductions in history. By the way, the stuff that happened to them afterwards, after the abduction experience, is even stranger than the original experience. But at any rate, Barney becomes kind of unconscious for part of the time, and you could say in kind of a stupor. Betty Hill is alive and well, conscious and in a real ball of fire and giving the aliens hell. So you have this strange, situation where one seems to be a bit unconscious or not completely aware of what's going on, and the other is perfectly conscious. Also, that while they had a very, very similar experience, it wasn't exactly similar. Like the facial features of these aliens or whatever they were a little bit different, kind of mirroring this situation that Elliot O'Donnell reported on. And another comparison would be Pascagoula, Mississippi. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Calvin Parker's out now. Finally broke his silence and is talking about what happened. But 1973, Pascagoula, Mississippi, October, they're abducted. And the similarity there is that Parker goes out almost right away, becomes unconscious, where Charles Hickson is awake through the whole event. So again, I mean, I'm not being dogmatic about this, but there do seem to be parallels between some of these things that past and present.
Definitely. Well, Kevin Parker's actually been on one of the other shows on our network. He's actually been interviewed by one of our guys, so that's been worth having a listen to.
Yes, I'm really glad that he's. There's a lot of fascinating things about that. I would love to interview him sometime, because there was also a in '73 reported by David Webb that around the same time a young boy saw one of these. Claw-like creatures that they reported that seemed more android than sentient creatures. Saw him in his backyard. There was another report about a month earlier, and I can't find the source right now, but it's one of those things that I've read, and I know I can find it. I just haven't found it yet. But a woman had one of these bedroom invaders, and it was very much like these android-like, claw-like entities that Hickson and Parker encountered. Only this thing drifted through the wall like a classic apparition. And this happened a month before the Pascagoula incident. So she had no knowledge of any of this.
Sure.
So very, very interesting stuff.
Absolutely. That's one of those things I was talking about earlier on. Those kind of phenomena people have late at night in their bed or in the early hours of the morning where they wake up and feel there's a presence there. And from a lot of the things people talk about, the people I've spoken to, they are convinced there's something there. But again, there are different belief systems or ideas given different descriptions of things. But it's interesting to say that woman had no idea of another description that was the same as that, but yet she was saying that. Because it's another thing that's often struck me about those kind of descriptions. People never describe anything quite nice and pleasant. They don't see like a unicorn walk through the room, or they don't see sort of like a pop star or something. It's always something unnatural and uncomfortable, and it's a scary phenomena rather than something that would be quite pleasant to see and experience. So there's a wide variety of descriptions of these kinds of phenomena, but so again, it begs the question if they're seeing a particular thing or it's something that their mind is trying to comprehend and it comes through with what they understand. I
think certain archetypes maybe.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's something that's very much my bag as well. That kind of deep level of subconscious archetypal imagery that you're tapping into that's part of that phenomenon. I mean, that's one of the things. The archetype of the witch is something that, you find in different cultures around the world that have a similar kind of description of the classic witch, the old crone. It's often seen that way. Now, you could talk about different patriarchal societies have certain ideas about older women, but you have in other societies that are not so patriarchal that still have that same kind of archetype of the crone, the scary witch woman, and you see it in different cultures again. So there's that kind of deep resonance in the mind of certain kinds of phenomena appear the same to different unrelated cultures. So it goes down that road, as well as trying to find a description of these things that fits everyone's understanding, because you just don't get it. You get these connections and similar phenomena, but the descriptions do vary enormously.
Very much the trickster element seems to be in there.
Indeed. Yes,
underneath.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. Jacques Vallée said something once that the phenomena negates itself. In other words, somebody sees a UFO. Sometimes somebody will come to the door in an official capacity or a Man in Black type or whatever and say, don't report your sighting. This might even be a situation where they haven't reported. So this thing shows up. Other times the reports are so bizarre that people are unlikely to even report it, because in matter of fact, there's a lot of situations where eventually somebody will report an incident, but later on they'll come out with the really weird details that they would say, we didn't want to tell you this before because we didn't want you to think we were crazy. But you still have this sort of weird balance where it is so bizarre that it's not believable. But even if they report it, people aren't going to buy into it, like Joe and his pancakes,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think Valet was onto something, and that seems to tie into that trickster concept, which is, if you look at places like the Skinwalker Ranch and some of these high strangeness areas, Point Pleasant, and so forth, there's a very, very strange element there that seems to pull it back into the realm of, some kind of, I don't know, interface with human consciousness.
Absolutely. As we were talking about on the show a few weeks ago about Rendlesham Forest, we have an obvious UFO incident that we all know about in 1980. But as I was saying on the show, there are a number of different events over the years about that general area that just don't defy logic, don't make any real sense. Strange sightings of abnormal creatures, things acting in impossible ways. I mentioned that two-dimensional image that someone saw walking across the road. At one angle, it was like side on, it was perfectly normal, it was a strange creature, but turned 90 degrees and it was flat, completely flat, and then turned back again and carried on walking across the road. So it's literally just two-dimensional. I mean, that's the one that's really stuck in my mind, that was told to me by the guy who'd recorded the event from somebody else. It was secondhand, but it was still a phenomenon that I found absolutely fascinating. So there is definitely places around the world that are areas of high strangeness, absolutely, where a number of phenomena are seen over the years that, again, sorry, appear different to different people, of different mindsets, but are clearly seeing something that is undoubtedly abnormal, paranormal, supernatural, whichever term you prefer.
Well, let's go back to cryptids a little bit. We're all fascinated by the Loch Ness Monster. And I had a chance to, in 1973, I had a chance to backpack throughout Europe and so forth. And I got a chance to actually see Loch Ness, which was really cool. Now, I had just read a few months before that a book by F.W. Holliday called The Great Orm, that's O-R-M, which is simply an ancient word for worm, of Loch Ness. And it was fascinating. And at that period of time, he believed it was a flesh and blood creature. And he didn't buy the plesiosaur model because it didn't really make sense. If it was plesiosaur is an air-breathing creature. Even if it survived millions of years, it probably wouldn't be surviving in the loch with those kinds of temperatures and needing to get air once in a while. We would have had many more sightings. Sure. But he thought it was kind of an oversized mollusk, and there were some really fascinating land sightings to see this thing kind of slither across the road like a big worm or whatever. But then, like so many people, like John Keel, like Jacques Vallée, like me, like so many researchers, and probably yourselves, something wasn't fitting. He found that Loch Ness was a UFO hotspot. There was a Swedish journalist that encountered some little men in some kind of a strange craft when he got lost around the woods and foyers. And at first he thought it was a submersible with divers, but these guys got in this thing and took off. He goes back to Sweden to write his article, and he's plagued by a man in black on his property. We know that because there was some correspondence between him and John Keel. But the thing is that Holliday was examining other lakes and lochs in Scotland, Ireland, and so forth, because if you go around the world, you find similar creatures with the humps and the long neck. But some of these lakes were so small that the fish population wasn't big enough to support any kind of a creature that size, much less a colony. So he was finding. So he went back. He started to read Carl Jung. Carl Jung wrote Flying Saucers, A Myth of Things in the Sky.
Oh, absolutely.
And kind of related the flying saucers to the collective unconscious. Yeah. And so he went back into, of course, we have the Kelpie, the water horse, which was a shapeshifter and thought of as evil, by the way. And also he found these old carvings, ancient carvings, where you had the disc or the mandala or whatever in conjunction with the serpent or the worm. And he thought they were kind of two sides of the same phenomena, good and evil. But he began to believe that Nessie was probably more of a paraphysical being than a flesh and blood unknown creature.
Well, that goes in line with a lot of other, like even the North American Bigfoot and Sasquatch has, believe, just based on the evidence and people's experiences, that it is more of a paratype of creature that has high strangeness attributes to it, and it's not just a typical flesh and blood hominid. I mean, I have a lot of friends in the Bigfoot research community, and most of them do look at it as an undiscovered great ape or some kind of animal. And I respect their opinion, I do, but there's too many other stories out there of people having such odd experiences with it that it's very it's just too strange. You mentioned Skinwalker Ranch earlier. There's the part in the book Hunt for the Skinwalker George Knapp and Colm Kelleher wrote. And one of the phenomenon that was witnessed by the NIDS team that was investigating the ranch was they were watching this area night vision one night, and they watched this portal open up, and this Bigfoot-like creature crawls out of it, jumps out of it, and runs into the woods.
Right, I remember that.
So, and even in the East Ranch up in Washington, are you familiar with the East Ranch?
Yes, I think James Gilliland.
Yes. And,
right.
Not only do they deal constantly with seeing UFOs up there, but they've had a lot of Bigfoot encounters around the area too. And the phenomenon seems to be connected in some way. In fact, that's what I seem to be finding in a lot of this stuff. What used to be what we would look at as all separate types of phenomenon, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, cryptid, other cryptid creatures, is way more interconnected than we realize, because it's all part of this hidden reality that we're just now, I think, I wouldn't say we're understanding, because I think we're far from understanding it, but we are beginning to understand that it may all be related.
You think it's possible that we're breaking down those categories, aren't we? It is almost human nature to categorize things to make them more understandable, more kind of into chunks that we can make sense of. But as you say, the categories we've created are starting to break down. These things don't fit into any one particular grouping. And I've often wondered, is it possible that there are two kinds of Bigfoot? That there is the missing hominid, this tall ape-like creature who is a physical flesh and blood creature. He exists. But so does the other one. That's, again, it's because we have an understanding, an idea of the possibility of that thing existing, that's an image that mentally is projected onto the more paranormal version of the thing. So maybe both of them are real.
Well, I kind of look at it that maybe the Bigfoot is a real creature, but yet it has paranormal elements to it in terms of being able to come in and out of our reality and dimensions. Being that it shows an intelligence that is a lot higher than any normal animal, and could be on par with what we look at as the fairy culture, the dwarves, elves, fairies, which are obviously intelligent beings and not just animals or creatures. So when we're dealing with some type of intelligent type entities that seem to be able to either mask themselves by some kind of camouflage or concealment, or able to physically move in between our reality and their reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually raises an interesting question in itself. We were saying before about the fairies and things along those lines, trolls, etc. We don't get reports of those sorts of sightings anymore. If you go back 150, 200 years, that was all that was reported. So it seems as if either they've just suddenly vanished for no reason, or there is a different descriptions are now being applied to that same phenomena. That's also an interesting element, that there is a shift into our more modern understanding. We're abandoning older terminology in favour of new one that still is categorising things that probably don't belong in a particular category.
Well, it does seem like some of these are flesh and blood, and then you have sort of the counterfeit, like the strange ones in Pennsylvania. John Keel actually addressed that possibility. He talked about paranormal mimicry, that perhaps you had some real nuts and bolts UFOs, a real cryptid, and so forth. But there's something, that mechanism in human consciousness, whatever it is, the ultra-terrestrial, the transmogrification of energy, that's for some reason mimics those things. So you'll get a UFO that looks like it changes shape and does impossible things. It may not be due to technology. It may be because it's more of a thought form or something like that. But even Ron Moorhead, Ron Moorhead was still is the premier Bigfoot researcher in the Northwest. He's the one that captured the Sierra Sounds, those great recordings of Bigfoot that have been analyzed.
Yes, those were incredible.
Well, his most recent book was called Quantum Bigfoot. And he says right in there, he says, this is a guy that believed Bigfoot was flesh and blood. He had interactions with them out in the wilderness. He says, Bigfoot is interdimensional. So that's, I think he disappointed a lot of people that are still believing that Bigfoot is totally completely a flesh and blood creature without any other strange overtones. Let me give you another weird connection here. I love these things. Alan Godfrey, he was a British police officer in, I think, Todmorden. Am I saying that right?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Okay. This goes back to.
I know where you're going with this one.
Okay, good. 1980. Kind of a classic abduction. He's out on patrol. He has missing time. So several months later, he gets a legitimate hypnotherapist, puts him under, and he does eventually have the classic examination, with no deductible and no copay, without asking. But before that, he's apparently he's in this room, and the the hypnotist is asking him questions about what he's seeing, and there's kind of a pause there, and he says, "There's a bloody dog in here." This guy's saying one of these classic large black dogs of British folklore, not just British folklore, is in this UFO, ostensibly an ET-controlled UFO. And of course, we have the whole folklore of the black shuck.
The black shuck, absolutely, yeah.
Yes. And that there's all kinds of connections with that into the Dogman phenomena in the U.S. And that even actually goes back to Mothman, because John Keel, I know I'm going all over the place, but these things all connect somehow.
Oh, no, absolutely.
John Keel found these large dog-like footprints behind the old TNT power plant, along with some other footprints that might have been related to Mothman. Whatever these dog-like footprints were, he said that had to be a creature 200 to 300 pounds heavy because of the way it imprinted in the ground. I'm pretty sure Mothman didn't have big floppy dog feet. There was another UFO sighting in Charleston around that same time period. A very bizarre looking retro UFO with a propeller on the bottom and wheels like caster wheels. I mean, it just didn't make any sense. But in that same area, John Keel found more of these large dog-like footprints. So he consulted with Ivan Sanderson, and Ivan Sanderson said to Keel, he said, yes, for some reason, these prints are showing up in these paranormal hotspots. We don't have any more information than that. I attend Michigan MUFON meeting and meetings from time to time. And last year, Dr. Chuck Lietzow, retired professor, he was doing research on Bigfoot and UFOs in Michigan. And he said the same thing without knowing anything about this literature. He said, for some reason, in these areas, these large dog-like footprints, presumably connected to the Dogman, I don't know, keep showing up in these paranormal hotspots. So again, you've got, and I consulted with Linda Godfrey, the lady who has written The Beast of Bray Road and has followed these kinds of cryptids and others for years. And she confirmed it. She said, yes, this seems to happen. So the point is this: you have four researchers separated by half a century, all telling us that these footprints, these type of footprints, are showing up sometimes in what we would call window areas or paranormal hotspots. So again, I don't have an answer, but isn't that interesting?
Absolutely. I would suggest checking out a book by a chap I know called Mark Norman, which is The Black Dog Folklore, which he really goes into a lot of detail about the folklore mythology around the black dog site, the black shuck over here in the UK. So that's worth checking out because he really does dig into all the details of that. But yeah, I do wonder if the black shuck and sort of the dog man in America, there's reports of them supposedly over here, if they are, again, the same kind of phenomenon, because historically, we in the UK, there are lots of stories and folklore mythology about the black dog. That's what we see because it's part of our culture, if you like, our own understanding of this phenomenon. But in America, you see Dogman, but it's the same phenomenon, but being viewed slightly differently depending on your own background and culture and interest. So that's what I find the most fascinating is those, as we were saying before, there's little connections underlying these desperate stories you think have no real connection to each other. And yet, if you look at certain details, you think, hang on, that thread's running through all of these stories.
Very interesting. Another kind of link to this idea of, I don't know, human consciousness reflecting back what's in the collective and so forth. Gustav Davidson wrote a book called A Dictionary of Angels. This is back in the 60s. You're familiar with that.
I have it on my shelf.
Oh, excellent. Yes. He you couldn't believe he went through all kinds of, religions, folklore, and so forth, and was documenting all these angels. And like some people in the UFO field, cryptid field, or whatever, he became obsessed. And he talks about, I'm just going to quote a little bit of this. He said at this stage of the quest, I was literally bedeviled by angels. Now, he believed he was documenting, reporting on good angels and bad angels. These weren't just the good guys that we see, in the all the paintings and so forth. But he said they stalked me and beleaguered me by night and day. I could not tell the evil from the good. I began to move in a twilight zone of tall presences. And one time he was returning from a friend's house. It's getting dark. It's getting dusk. And he's cutting through an unfamiliar field. Bad idea. That's a bad idea in all the movies anyway. Yes. Don't cut through an unfamiliar field.
Stay on the path.
But he said this nightmarish shape loomed up in front of him, barring his path. And he was able to fight his way around it. He wakes up the next morning and he said, I don't know what I encountered, a ghost, an angel, or a demon. But here it is. He is heavily immersed in the lore of angels and demons and so forth. And then he has one of these experiences. Now, don't you guys think that in the literature that there are people, take Albert Bender, one of the first guys that would encounter the Men in Black, and some others. It seems like some people, again, if these reports are true, that get immersed in this stuff, have, experienced the manifestation, experienced the phenomena to the point where it drives them crazy. It happened with John Keel. Other people like me who are just as, I think, fascinated and perhaps obsessed, nothing happens to me. So what is that all about?
Welcome to the club.
I was about to say that about poor Mark, though. He's not had that major experience, have you?
I can't. I think I need to just shut up sometimes and take a step back and really look at things, because I have had a lot of experiences in my life. It's just, I've never seen a ghost full on. I've never seen a Bigfoot or a cryptid. I've never seen, but at the same time, being an investigator myself, I've had a lot of strange experiences. I've had a lot of things happen. I've experienced sleep paralysis in a house that had activity. I've seen last year strange lights in the sky that, I know my aircraft and I couldn't identify this. I've heard phantom footsteps. So these just need to, I think, take a step back and realize you're not going to always get what you want, like the Rolling Stones say. But things are still going to happen if you pay attention to it and don't blow things off as much, and keep that open mind. Not so open your brains fall out, but open enough that you recognize when something odd is happening, or what you're seeing. And this is why I'm so fascinated more than anything with the high strangeness phenomenon, because it's one thing to sit there and say, oh yeah, I saw a Bigfoot, or I saw a UFO, or even aliens. But when something like Mothman comes along, and it is so damn weird that it's hard to classify what it is you're experiencing. It almost feels like your reality just shifted, or you're looking at something more in a vision and dream than you are in our physical reality. So I love the weirdness. I love it.
Yes, and it's endlessly fascinating, because we have, even though we still really don't know what's going on, we have made some progress. I mean, like this idea of like John Keel saw that the interconnectedness of all these things early on, before many people did. And you guys are probably familiar with Rosemary Ellen Guiley.
Yes.
Yes, great researcher. Has done all. Anyway, I met her. My wife and I met her at the Mothman Festival in 2006, and one of the things she was investigating was shadow people, and she wanted to talk to people about their experiences, whether they were bedroom invaders or whether they saw them wherever they saw them. And the next year, she always speaks at the festival. She talked about her findings. And she found out that a significant percentage of those people that experienced shadow people in one way or another were also experiencing classic alien abduction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who would have seen that coming? I think Whitley Strieber has had a lot of experiences like that too. So last year, a young lady contacted me from New Hampshire, and she and her husband had seen they kind of like your experience. They saw some strange lights. They're very familiar with regular aircraft lights because they live right near an airport. But something was wrong about these. And then all of a sudden they noticed, and they didn't realize it till later, they noticed that they were missing about a half hour. And when they came out of it, this giant black triangle was passing overhead so low that it was touching the tops of the trees. And that was it. So she contacted me, and fortunately, if I was frozen in the 1960s, I would have said, that's really cool. And at that point, she was not able to be regressively hypnotized. It wasn't working for her. Later on, she did. But I would have just left it at that. But I started asking John Keel style questions, Rosemary Ellen Guiley style questions. I found out that she had experienced shadow people. Both her sons were experiencing orb phenomena. Her younger son was seeing orbs dancing outside his window at night. The older son saw an orb circle him in the house and come up to his face and take off. And I asked her, I said, this is going to be probably a strange question, but have you ever seen anything like a Bigfoot or some kind of a strange creature? And she said, well, no. And then she said, oh, wait a minute. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law saw something very strange in that general area, and it was panther-like, standing on two legs, standing right next to a tree. When it saw them, it took off. So, again, back in the old days, I would have had no clue to ask these kinds of questions. But then you find out that this young lady didn't just have an abduction experience, but she had, all kinds of other things going on. And then it gets even weirder. It turned out she did contact a local UFO group. And when they were over one day, a black Cadillac went up and down their road, which was a dead end. It went up and turned around, dark, windows, couldn't see anything. Mm-hmm. And she finally was able to make a breakthrough with the hypnotherapist of finding out what happened. And she saw two sort of light-skinned grays. There was sort of an angelic type, like a woman or something there, telling her to be calm, it's all right. And then she saw some other things, sort of a horrific spider-like creature or something she couldn't even describe. Just bizarre. So anyway, she's driving home. She gets on the phone because she wants to tell this original UFO investigator that she finally made a breakthrough. And before she could tell him, he said, "Wait a minute, I have to tell you this first." He said, "I had kind of an out-of-body dream where I went into your bedroom where your husband and you were sleeping." He described the scene to the point where he knew that it happened. But standing next to their bed in his out-of-body experience or dream or whatever were these two of these light-skinned grays,
Blimey.
basically telling him, "Yes, we are examining her. We are making these abductions." Now, if that isn't a mind blower, I don't know what is. But and then you wonder, what do all these legs, these things connected with a basic abduction experience, which can be pretty strange all by itself, what does all the rest of that mean?
Well, one thing I find about the abduction phenomenon in general is I know a lot of people, experiencers, abductees, however you would like to call them. A lot of people are very resentful. They go through anger. I know several people that I've interviewed. They don't understand it. Why are they doing this to me? And yet, when you going off of what you just said right there, these things sometimes take the time to tell people things. They talk to you. It's like, yes, we're doing this, or we need you to do this, or if it's not like, going to the vet or even worse, animal testing, where we as humans don't even ask animals if they mind or try to calm them down. Cosmetics labs and pharmaceutical companies and whatever just use animals to experiment on and feel no remorse for it. So the fact that these things still they seem to do with us as they want, and yet at the same time they still take the time to talk to you. Like I mentioned Whitley Strieber a lot, based off of his books, Communion and Afterwards. And he'd mentioned about one of his early experiences that he remembered. He's freaking out and screaming, and one of the beings just said, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" They could have just injected him to make him pass out, but,
Right.
It was a communication of, there still, to me, seems like a type of respect going on there.
On the other hand, when you look at the vast literature of encounters and the kinds of things that the entities, the others among us, tell people, sometimes they'll give predictions about what's going to happen to the Earth. There's any number of things. It does seem that that's a little bit different than what you're talking about. He was trying to make Whitley more comfortable, find out what was going on. But I would suggest to people that when they get messages about what's going to happen in the future and so forth, to be very cautious about believing any of these entities and their messages. I can't imagine how many times dire things have been predicted for the Earth, and the catastrophic Earth changes that haven't come to pass. And when some of them tell us what they're here for, sometimes they talk about hybridization, which is pretty creepy, and other things. I would just be very cautious that we're actually getting good information or the truth from some of these entities.
There is no reason to believe anything that we're being told. Even I've been doing a lot of when I go to the gym in the morning, I usually throw on the Paranormal Radio app, which we stream on, by the way. Paranormal UK Radio streams on the Paranormal app, but they also have a couple of old Art Bell replays playing old shows, and you get I spend my mornings listening to old Art Bell that I never got to listen to at the time back in the 90s and early 2000s, and now I'm catching up on all of these, and it's great. And the one thing they talk about when they talk about the conspiracies of the military and the government supposedly having a pact with aliens, and they allow the aliens to abduct people in exchange for certain technology, and yet there's also the stories about how they lie and they don't keep up their end of the bargain.
Right.
You know, they tell you what you want to hear. They manipulate. And that's where you do have to take what they say with a grain of salt. But there's also the other side of that coin is sometimes they tell you certain things, but I think they tell you something that only you can comprehend. There might be a lot more to it, but to tell you more, a person just wouldn't understand it or comprehend it because our brains don't work like theirs.
Right. Even some of I'm also fascinated by channeling. And I don't think all channeling is created equal. I think some of it may come from a higher source than others. But a lot of that is just nonsense stuff you can't trust either. They're just other messages from those beyond. And sometimes, when you get into the lore of the Space Brothers, the contactees, channelers, and some modern day UFO messages, a lot of that stuff blurs together. There is when you mentioned, some of these things that are kind of accepted now in the lore of UFOs about these packs and so forth. Some of that stuff, it's just as interesting to look at the individuals that like James Mosley, Gray Barker, all these great characters from years ago, and the contactees, George Adamski, Howard Menger, and so forth. And James Mosley wrote a book, of course he's deceased now, called Shockingly Close to the Truth. And he talks more about the personalities in the UFO field than anything else. And it's hilarious. And he talks about some of the hoaxes that he and Barker perpetrated. And I think one of them was the meeting between Eisenhower and the aliens. I think that was their doing. I'm not positive, but I know that they did do the infamous Strafe letter that they wrote to George Adamski. They got a hold of some State Department stationery, and they identified themselves as R.E. Straith. And they said, Mr. Adamski, we can't do this formally, but we really appreciate the kind of work you're doing. And of course, George Adamski is the gentleman that claimed he met Orthron, the Venusian, in the California desert back in '52. But it said, you're doing great work. And if you're ever in the area, stop by for a formal visit or whatever. And of course, it was all BS. But George Adamski is flashing this thing around like it really happened. And the FBI gets involved, and they're all mad and said, George, you can't do that because it's a fraud. And then they go and they question Barker. And they get onto him a bit, and Barker gets paranoid, and he smashes the typewriter that he wrote it on and hides bits and pieces of it in various walls in Clarksburg, West Virginia. So you got it's just the whole thing is fascinating because some of the stuff, some of the lore, some of the information is inexorably connected to the amazing characters that have come up through all this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a lot of different people involved, and doing radio as we have done for the last several years, we've got to interview a lot of great guests, a lot of guests that, they tell a story. I'm respectful, but in my mind, I'm sitting there going, yeah, I don't think so. But you know what? I also have to try to keep open-minded enough to say, who am I to say? Because the more I learn, the more I realize that there's so much I don't know. And, to stand here and spout something as an absolute, it's hard to do these days. It's very hard for me to say that anything is an absolute anymore because I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Even when you delve into some of the contactee stuff, some of it is definitely fraudulent, but you keep following that trail and you think, oh my God, there's something to some of this. Mm-hmm. So you're right about keeping the open mind.
And understanding, like another concept, we were talking earlier about mixed concepts. And once again, I'm going to throw out Whitley Strieber. I don't know why Whitley's on my mind so much lately here, but, it's things that he had mentioned. And there was a concept early on that I struggled with. I really struggled. I go, oh, this is crap. This is absolute crap. I don't believe this. But then over time, I started to allow it to kind of come into my paradigm, and also reading the works of like John Mack and some of the Dolores Cannon, some of the the people who work with contactees. When Whitley first talked about seeing dead people during his encounters, and finding out that in one way or another that these beings, which we call aliens, but they may not be from other planets. They may be from somewhere else, maybe within a different reality, within our space. We don't know. And some of them at the very least, and you have to say some because there seems to be lots of different types of entities and aliens out there with different agendas, but some of them seem to be directly working with us on a spiritual level. And whether you want to look at it from the New Age concept of raising consciousness and awareness so we all move up to the next vibration, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
No.
Or dealing with the actual cycle of whether it's reincarnation, coming back, cycling of souls. I mean, it's really fascinating concept that it adds a whole new take on the idea of our connectedness with, other entities and other levels of existence.
Right.
I'm sorry. I feel like I was just stammering all over the place in that one.
Not at all. Not
That's
at
okay.
all.
This is one you weren't, but this is one field, if we want to call it that, where you can stammer as much as you want, and you still sound like we know what we're talking about. Or at least we think we do.
We think we do.
As long as we understand ourselves, that's the main thing, isn't it?
That's right.
I mean, I think what we can say is said in many fields, not just in the world of the paranormal, that there is no one single objective reality. There is no one world out there that we will just tune into. Our concepts and understandings of the world are different depending on who you are, your background, your history, your culture, your identity. And it does alter the reality around you. Not mean literally making things appear and disappear, although sometimes these things happen. But we can't just say you take us all out of the world and there's one concrete reality that's objective and it's out there. That just is not the case. I mean, not just in the world of paranormal, is said in sort of philosophy and psychology that just the world doesn't work like that. It really doesn't work that way. That there is far more going on than is dreamed of in your world, Horatio, whichever the quote in from Hamlet is, which I just completely mucked up there. But you know what I'm saying? It's far more going on than we could possibly realise.
And there certainly isn't one answer to all these strange things that are going on.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Definitely. Well, we're coming up. We only have a few minutes left in the program. I think now would be a good time to mention and announce that Steve Ward, who we've been talking with this evening, is first of all, fantastic show, fantastic interview. You plethora of information, and you're going to be having your own show here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Yes, the high strangeness factor. No surprise in the title.
No.
And Andy has been, he and I have been pulling our hair out, knocking out the last technical details. We're going to make sure
I don't have much hair, Steve, so don't worry about me.
Oh my God! Then I will pull my hair out in lieu of you pulling your hair out while we figure. I think we've got it. I think we probably have it under wraps, but we'll make sure all that's set to go. And so I've got a pool of people that are interested in sitting down with me for an hour, and I'll be doing it every fortnight. I love saying the word fortnight, by the way.
That's the British term, fortnight.
Yes,
absolutely.
That's right.
Yes. Bi-weekly for us Americans.
Yes, right.
Okay. Well, we have that, and so that's going to be coming soon. We haven't nailed down an exact date on that, but we will be announcing it here in the next couple of weeks. So everybody, if you really enjoyed tonight's show, be sure to tune in to Steve's show. That will be premiering soon. We also have another show that's going to be premiering next week, Paranormal Dimensions with David Young. Will also be premiering fortnightly on Mondays. And of course, we have our shows with Jeff Davis's Peculiar World and our Scottish Boys with Weirder Hings. So we just have a lot going on here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network we're really proud of. I also want to do a shout out tonight because tonight we are also simulcasting over on XLR Radio, simulcasting the PAUK radio show. So we want to do a shout out to the folks over there. Thanks for streaming us, and to everybody listening over there. And we really hope you enjoyed the show tonight.
I certainly did. May I get a couple of quick shameless plugs in here?
Be my guest.
Before we go. You can hear me weekly on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files as a correspondent. Always a lot of fun. And I contributed a chapter to a book called Weird Winged Wonders, edited by Timothy Green Beckley. And no surprise, my chapter is all about the Mothman and the Mothman Festival. And I've also started writing a book with a great co-author and partner named Joey Medea, which it'll be a while before that's out, but it'll be very much about a lot of the things we were talking about tonight. And I certainly had a great time tonight, even though I'm sure we didn't solve much, but we definitely had a blast.
Can I just quickly say something else as well? As our listeners know, I've been covering for Mark for the last few weeks because Mark's work commitments got in the way. But this is my last show I'll be doing for a little while with Mark and Irene when Irene's around. So I'm stepping out of it. But I had a little chat with Steve on Sunday, and I'm occasionally going to come along and join in with Steve on his show, as maybe there's a bit of a co-hosting work going on there as well. So you haven't got rid of me completely, guys, even though this is my last show in the flagship show.
Well, I'm definitely going to corral Andy for a guest spot once in a while, and we'll pick his brains. And I would love to have him as a co-host from time to time.
That's certainly the plan.
Well, Andy, we'll drag you on our show back often, so don't worry about that. It's not like we're kicking you to the curb.
No, I would love to come on this show. I really do enjoy doing the show with you guys, definitely.
Well, that's the one thing. We have a great team here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. With Irene, hopefully, Irene, you're feeling better, and we'll be back to it next week. And our Tim Kelly, I forgot Tim's title now. He's going to kill me for that one. But Tim does a lot of great work, too. And all of our show hosts. I mean, we've really been growing, and things have been going fantastic. But we want to thank all of our hosts and all of you, our listeners, for helping us become the biggest and best paranormal UK radio network, the best UK-based paranormal network. So thank you very much for that. And on that note, I think that's it. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in. And Steve, thank you for coming on tonight. It's been fantastic.
Well, thank you for having me.
Andy, and we will catch everyone next week. So have a great evening, everybody. We'll catch you soon.